Hello and welcome to the Writing for Academic Publication webinar series hosted by the Graduate Writing Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. My name is Catherine Chang-Stahl and I will be your facilitator for this webinar. This webinar is focused on the topic of navigating authorship and collaborative writing. If you have watched any of the other webinars, you know that I draw a lot from my example of a co-authored piece with a professor, kind of walking through the behind the scenes of everything from finding a home to putting together the final touches before production team takes over. And throughout this whole process, I've learned a lot about writing for publication, which is its own specific genre. I learned about myself as a writer. I got to learn a lot of different practices that I wouldn't have if I were solo authoring. And so writing with others can be really fulfilling. Not only is it an intellectual practice, but it's a powerful one, empowering too, and definitely joyful when you write with others. But of course, it can come with its own headaches. And so part of this webinar is to go through some of the promises, but also the common pitfalls of co-authoring when it comes to writing for publication. There are many benefits to co-authoring or co-writing, however you want to call it. And I was fortunate to be part of a team in the spring of 2021 at Teachers College Record, one of the older educational journals, in putting together this webinar that was all about kind of the unwritten rules of academic publishing. And one of the things that we talked about in this webinar was this idea that at Teachers College Record, students, whether it's undergrad, master's, or doctoral students, contributed a little less than a quarter of all publications at the journal. And most of these student publications were the result of students co-authoring with others, whether they be peers, colleagues, advisors, or professors. And so I wanted to start this webinar with this piece of data because I think it's rather eye-opening. We often don't get a lot of mentorship when it comes to academic publishing. I know that some programs have built-in courses around navigating this very specific genre of writing, but for others, it's something that we learn on our own, whether through our own practice or having the opportunity to collaborate with someone else, whether it be our mentor, our sponsor, a colleague or not. And so co-authoring is something that can be really generative, especially if you are kind of navigating publication for the first time. There's a lot to be learned from someone who has gone through the process more than you have. Of course, publication is varied. It depends on where you want to submit your work. It depends on the discipline. It's a very personal process too, but there are definitely many kinds of benefits when it comes to doing this collaboratively. When it comes to my own collaborative experience in terms of writing for publication, I've had only positive experiences. And what I'm showing you here is a Google Doc that my co-author, Professor Joanna Literat, and I sort of hopped on over the course of several months in developing a manuscript on Gen Z identity dynamics on TikTok. And this particular slide just shows you the ways that my mentor, who was also my co-author, guided me through many parts of the writing process, the logistical parts, the conceptual parts, literally everything. Here, I was taking some notes on what I think should be going into the abstract. This was one of my earlier publications, and I took notes based on the website. And my co-author jumped in and kind of provided another perspective on thinking about the abstract. And so this is just one example of how having someone else there can not only provide you with emotional support, but also that much refreshing other perspective that is experienced, to help you save some headache and kind of streamline the process. So the way that she described the abstract, for example, was to describe it as a super high level summary of each of the sections. So essentially taking a key idea from each of the headings of the manuscript and making that part of the abstract. In this particular view here, you can see how I had drafted certain sections, and my co-author went in and gave me really generative, constructive feedback. And so another benefit I would say of co-writing is that you have sort of a built-in peer review process. Peer reviews are emotional, they're very personal. And the process that you go through with journal publications, they can be rather brutal. And so when it comes to co-writing, I think it's really important that you find someone that you trust, someone who you respect, someone that you feel comfortable being vulnerable with, because it is a very intimate process. So you can see how here my co-author gave me very straightforward feedback, cautioning me against overgeneralized claims that I was making, helping me sort of stay back on track and not trying to extend too far from the data we had collected. She gave me reassurance by saying, yes, all of this belongs, and does a really great job of explaining one of the trends that we were noticing. She was also very honest about what I thought would be memorable quotes, but some would maybe not align very well with the rest of the article. So in many ways, she provided a reality check. And because she had so much experience writing, I really trusted her opinion. So in this webinar, besides sharing personal experience, I wanted to share some practical policies and practices that undergird a lot of collaborative writing projects. I also wanted to draw from literature around kind of collaborative writing to share some strategies for forming co-authorship teams in case that's something that you want to pursue. So there are different types of co-writing relationships. Some people choose to write with an advisor, so someone who's very experienced and is an expert in your field. Sometimes we want to write with colleagues and peers, and this might be more of a horizontal writing relationship where we're all kind of learning together by doing. If you're part of a larger research lab or group, you might be co-authoring with 3, 4, or more other individuals. Whatever the research dynamic, writing dynamic, it's important to be upfront about what your needs are and to have your expectations clarified. So it's important that I've heard from my own experience, but also hearing other authors share their experiences with co-authoring, that it's really important to have that open, transparent discussion about who is doing what, who is going to be first author, who's going to be second author, and what are the roles and responsibilities for each person, and to make all these decisions, lay them all out before writing the manuscript so that feelings are not hurt, there is clarity with expectations, and just a lot of transparency. Of course, sometimes this decision is not one that is made collaboratively. Sometimes the principal investigator of a research lab might delegate specific responsibilities and assign authorships. So maybe that decision is made by a single person, but whatever the case, if there is not transparency around authorship, I think it's important to bring this up as a way to protect your own time and energy, and to protect your feelings, to be honest. There are a couple of writing practices that shape a lot of collaborative experiences. I'm taking this from the Research Whisperer blog, which was referenced in a different book. So one idea is this idea of layering, where one person composes the first draft and then the other co-authors will make alterations in a serial manner. There's another practice called bricolage, where co-authors are given different sections to write and then they're pieced together. A similar one to bricolage is something called Lego, where the co-authors work together on the overall manuscript and its structure. So thinking about the flow, thinking about the larger argument, all of that is done collaboratively. And then individual pieces are delegated. And to stitch everything together, the group leader, who is also designated the first author, is the one that ensures flow by putting the pieces together. Thompson and Kamler, in their book titled Writing for Peer-Reviewed Journals, describes 3 variations to the 3 practices I described just a moment ago. So one is called type talk, where 2 or more people physically sit side by side at the computer and they write together. A variation of this would be you have Zoom open or Skype or Google Hangout, whatever it is, and you have your camera on and you sort of are in the same synchronous space and you write together and you pause and you talk through things. Another writing practice is called cut it up and put it back together, where the co-authors divide the paper into different sections and they write these separately on their own time. And then one person comes along to put everything together so it's a single voice. So as you can imagine, with this one here, someone will maybe take on a little bit more of a lead and spend a little bit more energy on fusing the different sections together, and perhaps that person would be the first author. There's another writing practice called first cut, where one person takes the lead, writes the first draft entirely, and then others come along to add more, maybe delete sections, modify sections, etc. So it's similar to sort of like a serial alteration where you're basically passing the draft along the chain, if you will. So these are just, again, different ways that people write. There are other strategies, but these are some of the more common ones that have had success. So I wanted to talk through the 3 strategies from Thompson and Kamler just a little bit more so you have a better sense of how it works practically. So in type talk, you can think of writing as an extension of talk or conversation among or between writers. So this is where you have shared time and space, where there's that face-to-face dialogue, and what you are dialoguing about also shows up in your writing. So kind of there's a seamless transition from talking to writing. This type of dynamic involves a whole lot of trust, openness, and also attunement to each other. So if you know someone where you think alike and you find yourself finishing each other's sentences, this might be a really generative strategy for writing together, because your thoughts are basically becoming words on a page and you're speaking your ideas out and they get kind of scribed into matter, to borrow from Dr. Bhattacharya. This is a type of strategy where you see writing as a form of discovering together, and working in tandem is something that you value. And what has been helpful with this type talk strategy is sort of taking turns typing while the other person is verbalizing their thoughts and dictating. And so this is, I think, a really powerful strategy if you are working with one other author. So pair writing relationships. Cut it up and put it back together is a strategy where it can work really well with larger teams, but also with pairs. So you start together. You have an initial discussion about just the ideas and concepts you hope to put forth. All of the responsibilities are joint decisions. So you spend some time at the beginning sort of laying the groundwork. Then you divide up and you sort of cut it up. Each writer will take on certain sections, you play to your strengths, and then the text is put together in a way that there's a single unified voice with the piece, not a duet, not a chorus. And so there is some challenge to this form of writing in terms of finding that unified voice. And one way to bring about that is having a single person do more of the editorial work, putting together the entire piece, ensuring kind of that single voice. So in order for this strategy to work, it's important to have trust established, to establish full common ground as well. Timeliness is important because you will be working independently on certain sections. And so you sort of have to trust each other to have your sections done to fuse everything together. This is also a type of practice where you do need to find agreement with regards to how to put together your manuscript, thinking about the flow, the order, the structure. So all of this decision-making needs to be joint. Then there is the first cut. And this strategy works well with larger groups when there are multiple voices, different perspectives, different experiences with writing. All of that can be a strength when it comes to passing drafts between people. So a central part of this approach is this idea of developing progressive drafts that are then moved along from one person to the next, each person sort of layering their ideas while building on the other. So you can think of this almost like a relay race. So one person starts, takes the lead, and composes that first draft. It doesn't have to be a complete draft, but the idea is to provide the skeleton. There is little discussion about what this person writes, so little commentary. Then the person passes on to the next co-author, and that person will read this draft, fill in the gaps, maybe flesh out a few sections, maybe delete a few sections, maybe add new sections. And then this person will pass on to a third person, or perhaps if you're only writing with two people, you bring it back to the first person. And with each draft, you are further refining and revising your ideas and polishing the writing. So this approach might not be the most efficient approach, but it is considered a very conversational approach. One where you are revisiting ideas and letting things sort of shape subsequent sections. So it's a very iterative process. In order for this approach to work, the authors of the book that I'm drawing this from talk about the importance of having an open discussion of power relations and conflict resolution. One thing that they highlight is this idea of ego when a draft is being kind of revised, written over, remade. If we are really attached to our writing, we might feel offended by having someone strike out certain ideas, because things will get cut and removed and modified in this first cut approach. And so this might be something to have an open discussion around, is like, if some conflicts occur, how are you going to deal with them? And just ensuring that no one's taking this personally, that this is for the better of the writing. So in summary, Thompson and Kamler really highlight a couple of themes when it comes to these writing relationships. Trust, as something that I have brought up a few times, is really at the heart of this, being able to be open and frank about the writing process, about your ideas. And this connects with openness in kind of the communication that occurs. How are you going to deal with conflicts? Talk about that openly so it doesn't brew underneath the relationship. What happens if we feel like there are tensions? What do we do when difficulties come up or changes in plans are made? Something happens and we can't stick to our timeline. How are you going to communicate your needs and your situation? Mutuality is also something that shapes these writing relationships. Co-writing, as I've mentioned, can be beneficial for all partners. There's something beautiful about kind of coming together as collaborators and learning from each other and building off of each other. And it can be really powerful, especially if your co-author is from a different discipline, works with different subjects, has different theoretical frameworks that they're drawing from. It really adds richness and complexity to your writing. And that could be something that drives your writing relationship, this kind of intellectual growth endeavor. Safety net is something else that Thompson and Kamler talk about. This idea that it's important in this writing relationship to be vulnerable, because it is just a very vulnerable process. But as part of that vulnerability, to be each other's support system, be each other's safety net, encourage risk taking, be enthusiastic, be supportive, be in community. So the text by Thompson and Kamler, or Tomler, if you will, they highlight some of the problems that occur as part of poor collaborations. And I wanted to highlight some of these. So one common problem is this idea of an asymmetrical writing relationship. So this is when there is a power imbalance. For example, there's someone who's leading the research team. Maybe it's you writing with a superior, your advisor or sponsor, and they have certain ideas in mind that you have to adhere to. If that's the case, one way to avoid awkwardness and discomfort is to develop a protocol around authorship together at the very beginning of projects. Talk through how the writing is going to occur, who is going to be doing what, and establish very clearly who the first author is going to be, and negotiate it if you feel like certain things are not fair or not up to your standard. Another problem has to do with expectations that are unspoken, certain assumptions that you have about the writing partnership. Maybe one person sees the partnership going really well and expecting the partnership to extend into other writing projects, but perhaps the other person doesn't feel this way and sees it as a, quote, one night stand as opposed to a long-term relationship. So something to think about if you find yourself in this situation is to hold that open, transparent conversation around how long do you see this partnership lasting? What is the lifespan of the partnership? And just be really upfront about that. Ego can be a big concern when it comes to writing with other people. This manifests in you being overly attached to your own writing, which is understandable. It's very personal, and having a hard time compromising and letting go. This is something that I think we all have in us, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it can be a challenge when it comes to sharing the writing with someone else. And so doing a little bit of reflecting on your own needs, your own practices, your own anxieties around writing, and thinking whether writing collaboratively is something that can work for you. Writing solo could be a solution if you're just not ready, or you can think about having almost like a speed date to search for potential writing partners. And that leads me to this really funny set of questions from Thompson and Kamler that you can sort of think about, but obviously not ask openly because some of these are rather rude. But I wanted to include these questions because actually they're really spot on and are questions that you can think about in the background as you are searching for a writing partner. Sometimes you can learn this information from talking with others who have written with someone, learning more about their experiences, or if you feel comfortable just having an open conversation around some of these questions and what the potential writing partner has to say about them. So everything with like your timeline for writing, how do you deal with conflicts? What are your thoughts on first author? What are your strengths, your weaknesses, etc. So I want to sort of wrap this up with just sharing a little bit about terminology. I've used the word co-author a lot. So this is just anyone who is writing collaboratively with you. Not all co-authors put in the same amount of work, but if you are writing with someone, they are a co-author, even if they don't do a lot or they do a whole lot. First author is a person whose name is listed first, and they are the one who tends to do more of the heavy lifting. There are different expectations of first author. There's no universal guideline for first authorship. So I think it's important to discuss this openly and negotiate it with the people that you are writing. Sometimes when two people are working together and they're putting equal weight, however that's defined, you can also push for shared first authorship, which is when both authors are writing together and they both become first author. And this is often designated with a little asterisk to show that both authors contribute equally, because logistically someone has to be listed first, and that's often alphabetical. In some research disciplines, last author is another honor. This is usually given to the principal investigator, the research leader, or someone more senior, or someone who also has a leadership role, if you will, in the research project. But I would say that in the humanities and the social sciences, this idea, this practice of having a last author is not as common. And finally, corresponding author could be any of the individuals above. The corresponding author is the one that will correspond with the editorial team, with the journal editors, if anything comes up. They're the ones who will upload all the materials to the publication site. They're the ones who will draft, most often, the response letter, the cover letter. They're the ones involved in all the emailing back and forth. Something else I'd like to highlight when it comes to authorship has to do with how your name shows up in citations within the text, as well as the reference list. As you can see in the center meme here, this little boy says, "I worked so hard as co-author, then I became et al." This is the case with APA style for citations. With the newest version of APA, what happens when there are 3 or more authors is that only the first author's name is mentioned and everyone else becomes et al. Even if you're a second author, your name doesn't show up if the writing is done by 3 or more authors. And this is just part of what happens with the formatting rules per APA style. Your name, however, does show up in the reference list. This is different if you are co-authoring with just one other person, and there are 2 authors. Then both names show up in the citations within the text, and obviously both names show up in the reference list. So becoming first author has multiple benefits. One is obviously your name shows up in all the citations within the text, but being first author comes with certain responsibilities and roles. So it is not an easy role to take up. So a little bit more on shared first authorship. So this is when 2 or more individuals share the title of first author, often indicated with an asterisk at the end of the person's name. This is an example of a book chapter authored by 2 individuals. And as you can see, there's a little asterisk that says this chapter has been equally authored. So sometimes authors will decide on or first co-authorships and include a little notes at the end of the article or the end of a book chapter to specify the authorship ranking or roles. I also want to share other authoring practices. This is something called authoring as a collective and has become more and more common. So here's an example of the New London group. No one's name is highlighted in the name, but the New London group is comprised of a pretty large number of scholars spanning different locations, as well as different focuses within literacy. So this is another practice that you can pursue, especially if you are writing in a larger group, perhaps it's a research group, maybe it's a grad student collective, maybe it's a group that has a particular interest. So for example, I am part of a group at Teachers College called the Multimodal Scholarship Working Group. And we have been working on a piece that we are authoring as a group. And so authorship for a group is something that you can also navigate with a common name. And this is often a practice that makes it feel a little bit more equitable and for everyone to be seen equally. Here I'm showing you yet another example of a collective as the author. So this one is called the Literacy Futurisms Collective in the Making. And I imagine that somewhere within this article, they detail who the individuals are, but perhaps not. And so this is a practice that is fairly common within the kind of realm of literacy, but I imagine that this is also a practice that is becoming more and more widespread in other disciplines and fields as well. And with that said, thank you very much for engaging with this particular webinar. I hope this was helpful.